In today's video, I'm showing you how to make these colorful dies, and this is entirely hand-sewn plushie. These are made with felt and you can choose any color of felt fabric and even change the sizes as you like. I sell these on my Etsy shop and I also have these small dies I sell as car accessories as well. You can use these as a plushie, as a decorative or even for board games. Hoping this will be another fun project for you, let's get right into it. Let's start with materials and tools. You'll need felt fabrics in your color of choice and I'm using 6 different colors for 6 sides of the dies. Then you'll need matching embroidery thread colors to go with the felt colors. Fiber fill for stuffing, a small rod to help you in stuffing, pins, a hand needle, a fabric marking pen and a pair of scissors. Let's start making the pattern pieces for the dies next, and you can cut a square in any size as the pattern for the sides of the dies, and I went with 3.5 by 3.5 inch square. Then you'll need to cut a small circle shape to use as the numbers for the dies, and I cut mine using a quarter. You can use any small circular shape to make that template, and when you choose that, make sure 3 of those small circles can fit in lengthwise on the square with some space to spare at the edges. Otherwise, look for another one with a different size. These 2 are the only template pieces we need to complete this project, and now let me explain to you a simple principle you need to understand before making a dies. There are a total of 6 sides in a dies, and each side has assigned a value or a number from 1 to 6. The side which is directly opposite to one side is not a coincidence, and it depends on the total value of those directly opposite sides, which always adds to 7. Let me explain it further. This is how we decide which sides are placed directly opposite to each other. If you have number 1 on one side, and as you know, total of 2 directly opposite sides has to be 7, then the number on the directly opposite side has to be 6 in order to fulfill that need. Next, if you have number 2 on one side, for the total to be 7, the directly opposite side has to be number 5. Finally, if you have number 3 on one side, and for the total to be 7, you need to keep number 4 as its directly opposite side. Now this is the basic principle, and that's how directly opposite sides pair on a dies. Let me show you that in this dies. Number 1 always pairs with number 6 when placing directly opposite sides. Number 2 always pairs with 5. Number 3 pairs with 4 in order for the total to be 7. Now please keep this in mind when going forward. I hope I didn't confuse you with all the numbers, and we can now move on to cutting the felt pieces using the 2 template pieces we got earlier. I'm gonna start with cutting a total of 6 squares, and as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm using 6 different colors for that, 1 from each color. First, place your template piece on top of the felt fabric and use a couple of pins to keep that in place. I align 2 sides of the template with the 2 sides of the fabric. That way you can get most out of a fabric. After that, you can simply cut around it. Finally, remove the pins, and 1 out of 6 squares are ready at this point, and follow the same steps and you'll get all 6 squares just like that. Color selection is totally up to you, and you can always go for a more neutral color theme. Now let's move on to the other template piece, the small circle shape which represents 1 digit at a time. Since this is a small template, you can just hold that onto the fabric and simply cut around it. As you need a total of 21 of these circles to represent number 1 to 6, I think this way is much easier. You can also place the template piece on the top of the fabric and outline it using a fabric marking pen. After that, cut around the drawn shape, and I personally think the previous method is more practical since you have a considerably larger number of circles to cut. If you want to learn more about cutting felt pieces for a pattern, please make sure to check out our tutorial on that. I'll leave the link in the description. Even here, I decided to go with colorful circles instead of sticking to one color. So I have got 1 in dark purple, 2 in red, 3 in blue, 4 in orange, 5 in green and 6 in yellow. Now this is how I'm gonna arrange the 6 squares on the dice. Yellow and dark purple ones pair with each other, also meaning those two placed directly opposite to each other. Likewise, green goes with red. Finally, orange pairs with blue. Hoping you remember the basic principle I explained to you earlier, I'm going to place the circles on top of each square. As you can see, I used the color of the circles and squares interchangeably, so it makes sense to me when going forward. Now the way I'm placing these circles on the squares is gonna be the same way I'm gonna sew them after. You can always choose a different way to arrange the circles or feel free to use this basic pattern we see in a regular dice. This is a really simple project to work with and even suits for kids old enough to work with a hand needle and thread. All you need is time. Other than that, this is way too easy to complete. Now it's time to sew, and let's start with sewing these circles to the squares. Thread your needle with a matching embroidery thread color and make a knot at the end. I have double threaded mine and I'm going to use that throughout this project. The number of thread count you use is totally up to you. Place the circle on top of the square and use the whip stitch or back stitch to sew the circle to the square. I'm using the whip stitch here. For that, simply come up only through the background fabric closer to the edge of the circle and pull the thread all the way. Then go back down through both the background felt and the circle. Pull the thread from the back of the fabric and repeat the same steps all around the circle. This is how to use whip stitch in applique, and if you don't know how to do that, make sure to check out the tutorial on that as well. I'll leave the link in the description. One by one sew all the circles, and you can even use a contrasting thread color for this step to give it a more of a handmade vibe. This step will take the longest time to complete, but there is nothing complicated here and you'll be able to practice your hand sewing skills too. Whenever you are running out of thread or you are done with that particular set of circles, turn over to the wrong side of the fabric and make a couple of knots to secure the stitch. Finally, trim the thread short. At this point, we are all done with sewing the circles to the squares, and we can now start assembling the dies. I forgot to mention one thing. Whenever you are sewing the circles, especially when it comes to the squares with more circles, make sure you have enough space left at the sides. Otherwise, those circles get in the way while sewing these squares together. Now let's start assembling. First, thread your needle and make a knot at the end. Next, we are gonna sew two squares together along one of the sides, and let's decide how to select which two goes together. If you are taking number 1, the one thing you can't keep adjacent to that is number 6. because then it won't be the one directly opposite to the number 1. So if you are selecting a square to go with number 1, it has to be anything other than number 6, and I'm selecting number 2 square. Now keep the two wrong sides facing each other and make sure both squares are aligning with each other. After that, start to sew them along one of the sides from one end to the other. You can use either blanket stitch or whip stitch, and I'm using the blanket stitch here. We have tutorials on both blanket stitch and whip stitch on our channel, and make sure to check those out if you are interested. I recommend you to get a longer piece of thread for this step. That way it will allow you to sew continuously for a while. When you reach the last bit of that side, make your last stitch for that side as close as to that end. Then make a knot by going through the loop part of the last stitch. This will stabilize the last stitch on that side before we are moving on to the next side. Now it's time to decide which square goes next, and as you can understand, number 6 or number 5 is not an option, since then they won't be placed directly opposite sides with number 1 and 2. Your only two options will be 3 or 4, and I'm gonna go with number 3 square. Align that with either one of the previous two squares like this, and since I'm right-handed, it's easier for me to move clockwise by aligning number 3 with number 1 along that side. Then continue to sew along that side and make sure to move the needle in between that corner or through the wrong side of the fabric, so the thread won't be visible when you are moving from one side to another. Use the blanket stitch or whip stitch to sew the two layers together from one end to the other. Even here, make a knot after you have made the final stitch on that side to keep things stable. Now it's time to decide which square is gonna be next, and as you know, this is a 3-dimensional plushie. Whichever goes next will be directly opposite with number 2 square, and like I explained in the beginning, it has to be number 5 square. Keep that aligning with either one of the adjacent squares and continue to sew like we did earlier. There is nothing much to say after this point. Stick to the principle that the total of directly opposite sides is equal to 7, and you will easily attach all 6 squares one by one. At this point, we are sewing the last square of the dies and some of the corners are already done. Now what you have to do is continue sewing all the sides to make this into a partly open box for now. For that, leave 2 or 3 adjacent sides of a single square unsewn. We can then completely stuff with fiber fill using that opening. Now it's time to stuff, and as you can see, I left 2 sides of number 5 square unsewn for stuffing. If you leave only one side, then it will be harder for stuffing and I don't think you'll like that, so I think this is more practical. We can sew along the 2 sides and enclose the opening after this is completely stuffed. My thread is running short for sewing 2 sides later, so I'm going to trim it here and start with a new thread. For that, insert the needle towards the inside of the dies and then come through a point a little further away from the first point. Then pull the thread towards you and trim it. This is how you hide away the remaining thread ends without showing to the outside. Now let's start stuffing, and you'll need a little more fiber fill for this project compared to the other small felt ornaments we did earlier on this channel. Use enough fiber fill when stuffing, otherwise you won't be able to keep the shape of the dies. Also, don't just pick a handful of fiber fill and then just fill it like lumps. Instead, spread them into small parts like the way I do, so they are evenly spreaded, and that will eventually give you a plushie with a soft texture. You can use a small rod like this one to push the fiber fill to far corners and sides. After you have stuffed enough, now it's time to sew along the remaining sides. Thread your needle and make a knot at the end. Start at one of the ends and then you can sew continuously. If this is your first time watching my channel, we have plenty of felt ornament projects and most of those come with free patterns as well. Please make sure to check those out too. You can also stuff more while sewing, it's totally up to you. When you reach the other end, make a couple of knots using the loop part of the final stitch, and if you are having questions regarding these small things, it's about time you check out our tutorial on the blanket stitch. Finally, insert the needle inside of the dies and come up at any point a little further than the first point. Pull the thread towards you and trim it. With that final step, we have a beautiful dies, and now it's your turn to make one too. These will be wonderful gifts, and who says plushies like these are only for kids? Let me know what you think of it, and please take a moment and subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you all for watching, and I'll join you in the next one.